The lights in that banquet hall were too bright for a Tuesday dinner, but Desmond Okafor liked bright lights. He liked people looking at him. We were in Charleston, at his cousin's rented event room, 12 people around a long table covered in rented linen. I sat near the end, close to the door, the seat I always picked because I could watch the whole room without the whole room watching me. I used to think that was just my quiet nature. Now I know it was practice. Practice for exactly this kind of night. Desmond stood up with his wine glass in his hand, the way a man stands when he wants applause before he's even said anything. The table went quiet. His uncle Roscoe grinned like he already knew the joke. Desmond looked right at me and said, "Let me be honest with this family tonight. I only married Mary because I felt sorry for her." He smiled wider. "I mean, come on, who else was going to want an ugly fat pig?" The laughter came fast. Loud. Uncle Roscoe laughed hardest of all, and 3 or 4 others joined him, and the ones who didn't laugh just looked down at their plates instead of at me. I didn't flinch. I want you to understand that clearly. I didn't grab my napkin, I didn't push my chair back, I didn't give Desmond the broken face he was hoping for. I folded my hands in my lap and let every second of that laughter finish on its own, because after 9 years of marriage to that man, I had learned something simple. A hurt only has power over you the moment you let people see it land. My name is Mary Calloway, and the night my husband tried to humiliate me in front of his whole family was the night I finally stopped protecting him with my silence. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I want to know who's here with me. Now back to that table. The laughter was still dying down when a chair scraped back on Desmond's side. My stepson Julian stood up. 24 years old, tall like his father, but none of his father's showmanship. He didn't shout. He looked straight at Desmond with the calm of someone who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. He smiled once, small and sure, and said, "Dad." Then he said the sentence, "Mary's name is on the lease that started your restaurant. Maybe sit down before you say something else you can't take back." The room went so silent I could hear the ice melting in someone's glass. Desmond's hand, wrapped around that wine glass, started to shake. I looked at my stepson for 3 seconds. Then I looked back down at my plate, because I had just made a decision nobody at that table was ready to understand yet, and I needed them comfortable a little while longer. The house was too quiet that night to feel peaceful. I walked through the room slowly, the way you walk through a place you're already starting to leave in your mind. The kitchen counter I picked because it caught the morning sun. The bookshelf I built myself on a Saturday because Desmond said he'd help and then didn't come home until dark. The painting over the fireplace I bought with my own paycheck, 2 months before I ever met him. I touched none of it. I just looked and I remembered. There's a version of this story where I go upstairs and cry into a pillow that still smells like the life I thought we were building together. I'm not that woman anymore. I tried her on once years ago and she didn't fit me for long. I met Desmond at a food festival downtown on a warm September evening. He was charming, the kind of charming that fills up a room before he said a single interesting thing. It took me months to learn that the charm was the only thing he actually owned outright. He had Julian, 15 then, quiet in the way kids get quiet when they've seen grown-ups let them down too many times already. They were renting a small apartment above a laundromat that Desmond called, just temporary. I was 35. I had spent 13 years building a career as a food and beverage consultant, and until Desmond, I had never once made a big decision with my heart instead of my head. That changed with him, and people like to say smart women get fooled because they can't see clearly. That wasn't what happened to me. I saw everything clearly. I saw a man with big dreams and small discipline, a son who needed steady ground under him, and a life that could become something real with the right structure holding it up. And honestly, I was tired. Not sad, not desperate. Just tired of building every single room of my life completely alone and calling that strength instead of admitting it was lonely. The restaurant was my idea first. Not in the vague way people say things are their idea. I mean, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and worked out the whole plan before I ever showed it to him. I had a contact from my consulting years, a man named Ben Whitfield who ran a small chain of event venues, and he owed me a favor. I called that favor in for Desmond. The very first catering contract that business ever signed existed because of a phone call I made using my name and my years of trust. The starting money, $38,000, came from my late mother's savings, an account Desmond never had access to and never asked hard questions about, because asking would have meant admitting what he was really receiving. In the beginning, my name was on almost every piece of paperwork. Not because I was careful and suspicious, because back then there was no reason not to trust the man I loved with the details. Then the business grew fast. New clients every month, new hires, new headaches. Desmond slowly took over the licenses, the renewals, the official filings, while I ran the kitchen and the contracts. Small changes happened, one form at a time, always explained away as cleaning things up or making the paperwork simpler. Nothing vanished all at once. That's exactly why I didn't see the whole shape of it until much later. I let him be the face of it because I believed a man who felt important would eventually grow into someone who deserved that importance. That belief cost me more than anything else in my professional life. I walked into my home office, the little room I'd turned into a workspace years ago, and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. The folder was right where I'd left it, plain brown, held shut with a rubber band. Inside were papers I'd been keeping without ever fully admitting to myself why. Contracts, bank transfers. A copy of the original business license with a small detail that Desmond had quietly changed years later, something he called administrative cleanup. At the time I accepted it because I was busy running the actual kitchen, actual staff, actual orders, and trusting your husband with paperwork doesn't feel dangerous while you still think you're a team. I set the folder on the desk, didn't open it yet, turned off the light and went to bed. Not because I was done. Because I finally knew where to start. Julian knocked twice before I even reached the door. I'd been up since 5 that morning, sitting with coffee I hadn't touched. He came in, sat across from me, folded his hands the way he does when he has something important to say, and looked me right in the eyes. "I need to tell you some things," he said. "Just let me get through all of it." I nodded and he began. He told me about the year before I came into their lives, when he was 13 and slept on a couch for months while his dad took the only bedroom. He said it plainly, no anger in his voice, like describing rain. Happened. That was just how things were. He told me about the week the power got shut off because his dad had bought new sneakers instead of paying the bill. He told me nobody explained anything to him back then. He just learned to expect the worst and be quietly ready for it. "Then you showed up," he said, "and the whole temperature of the house changed. Nobody made a speech about it. Things just started being steady. The fridge stayed full. The lights stayed on. I stopped doing math every morning about what was about to fall apart. I held my coffee cup tight and listened. I was 15, he said. Not a baby. And when you grow up watching adults barely hold things together, you remember details whether you want to or not. I remember whose money opened that restaurant, he said. I was in the next room when you called Mr. Whitfield the first time. I didn't remember every word, but I remembered your name because Dad kept repeating it after, telling people, Ben only took the meeting because Mary already knew him. That detail landed differently than anything else he'd said so far. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He opened an old folder of screenshots and notes he'd been quietly saving for years, the way kids do when they've learned that things can disappear if nobody writes them down. Then he slid over a printed photo, an old picture of my whiteboard, covered in my own handwriting, business numbers and supplier names, dated over a year before the restaurant ever opened its doors. You used to leave that board up for weeks, he said with a small shrug. I took a picture because I wanted to remember what it looked like when someone actually had a real plan. I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I looked at him. You're not going anywhere, I said. It wasn't a question. I never went anywhere, he said. You just weren't ready to notice yet. The folder was still sitting on my desk the next morning. I sat down in front of it the way you finally sit down in front of something you've been circling for years. Not rushing. Not scared. Just ready. I laid everything out in the order it actually happened, not the order Desmond liked to tell it. The first paper was a bank statement from 9 years ago, showing that $38,000 withdrawal. I remembered that morning perfectly. A gray Charleston morning, me sitting in my car outside the bank for a full 5 minutes before walking in, just feeling the weight of what I was about to do. Desmond never really asked where that money came from. He just said, "You sure about this?" And I said, "I am." And that was the whole conversation. The second paper was a printed email chain between me and Ben Whitfield. Ben had worked with me on event contracts for 6 years before Desmond ever shook his hand. When I called him about the new restaurant, he said yes because of my name, my history, my track record. Desmond came to that first meeting, shook hands, said the right things, and Ben was kind to him. But that relationship existed because of me, years before Desmond walked into the room. The third stack was the original business license. Desmond's name sat at the top as owner. But buried in the filing, under the section for startup funding, my name was still there. Mary Calloway, contributor. A later amendment had quietly relabeled my contribution as a simple spousal gift, a change I never signed off on and barely understood at the time. Back then the business was moving so fast, new clients, new staff, contracts stacking on top of each other, that Desmond gradually became the one dealing with outside paperwork, licenses, and the accountant since he was already the public face of the restaurant. The change was explained to me once, casually, in the kitchen, while he had papers under his arm and a phone against his ear. "Accountant wants everything standardized," he said. I accepted it because marriages don't usually fall apart all at once. They lean slowly out of balance while both people keep calling it teamwork. Something about that moment stuck with me though, enough that 2 years later I pulled the license myself from the state records. When I saw the change written in black and white, I made a copy that same day and set it aside. Desmond was the public face because I chose it that way. I believed a man who felt like a leader would grow into one. I handled the structure. He handled the smiling. 4 years that arrangement seemed to work, and I told myself it was working. What I understand now, sitting at this desk with 9 years of papers spread in front of me, is that I confused working with fair. The restaurant was growing. That part was true. But it was growing inside a structure I built, while pieces of what belonged to me quietly got smaller, one small paperwork change at a time. Every document on that desk had my fingerprints on it before it ever had his signature. I closed the folder gently. The originals were still safely filed at the restaurant office. I'd need those soon, but I wasn't walking into any lawyer's office until I understood exactly what story these papers could tell, and where the weak spots still were. The first time I noticed something was wrong, Desmond was laughing at his phone late one night. Not his normal laugh, a private one, quick and quiet, gone the second he noticed me in the doorway. He flipped the phone face down and mumbled something about a coworker's joke. I nodded and kept moving. I filed it away and said nothing. That was over a year before the dinner. What followed wasn't dramatic. It rarely is at first. It was small shifts in the air around a man who thinks he's being careful. His phone started charging in the bathroom instead of on the nightstand where it had sat for 8 years. His schedule started shifting with explanations that felt just detailed enough to be rehearsed. He stopped really looking at me when he walked into a room. Not with anger, just with the specific distance of someone whose attention had moved somewhere else and was now quietly managing that distance. I noticed everything. I said nothing because suspicion without proof is just pain with no shape to it. And I've spent enough years running kitchens to know you don't act until you've actually seen what's really going on. 2 weeks after the dinner, I found what I'd been quietly watching for. Desmond left his tablet open on the kitchen island, something he hadn't done in months. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just walking past. The screen was open to a hotel booking confirmation, a small inn 2 towns over, a date 4 days before the family dinner. His name on the reservation, a room for 2. Below it was a message thread with a name, Priya, no last name given. And under his reply to her, a photo she'd sent, time-stamped, unmistakable. The kind of photo a woman sends a man when she's confident the wife has already been dealt with. I stood at that counter for maybe 30 seconds. Then I took out my own phone and photographed the screen, the booking, the thread, the photo, the date, all of it, in under a minute, before setting my phone face down and walking to the fridge for what I'd actually come in for. That was the moment I expected something in me to break. It didn't break. Cleared. The grief I thought was coming had apparently already worked itself out quietly, during over a year of watching and noticing and saying nothing. What showed up instead, standing in that kitchen, was something colder and far more useful than grief, a complete absence of surprise. And underneath that, something close to relief. Because Priya didn't know it yet, but she wasn't inheriting a successful man. She was inheriting a mess that hadn't been counted up yet. Vivian Okonkwo's office was on the 9th floor of a building downtown, the kind of office where the elevator opens right into cool air and quiet carpet. I'd made the appointment 4 days after the dinner and told absolutely no one, not even Julian. A former client had given me her name years earlier and said, "If you ever need someone who won't blink, call her." So I called her. I was shown in right on time. Vivian was smaller than I expected, precise in the way people get precise after decades of making sure nothing they do can be misunderstood. She shook my hand once and pointed me to the chair. No extra warmth, no coldness either. I placed the folder on her desk. "Do you want to walk me through it, or should I just read?" she asked. "Just read," I said. She read for 12 full minutes without saying a word, going back twice to pages she'd already seen, once jotting a short note without even looking up. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at me straight on. "You're not here about a divorce," she said. "I'm here about what's actually mine," I answered. She asked careful questions. Was I there when the license was amended?
No.
Did I approve it in writing?
No.
Did I ever sign anything that could reasonably be read as agreeing to it? Nothing at all. She wrote another note. Then she folded her hands over the folder. "What you have here," she said slowly, "looks like a founding contribution that may have been relabeled without your real, informed consent. If the originals back up what these copies suggest, that matters a great deal. None of this wins anything by itself, Ms. Calloway," she went on. "But together, it builds a record of real involvement that's very hard to wave away as ordinary marriage support." That was the moment I trusted her completely. Not because she promised a win, but because she never once pretended this would be simple. "We'll need the originals through formal discovery," she said, "and that process moves slower than people expect. His side will challenge the value, the intent, the percentages, all of it. I want you ready for that now, not surprised by it later." "I understand," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Mrs. Okafor," she started. "My name is Calloway," I corrected her. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, recognition. "Ms. Calloway," she said again. "Based on what's on this desk, I don't think you're simply a spouse asking for a fair split. I think there's a real argument that you built and held together this business from the very beginning." Those words landed differently because she said them so plainly. "But arguments need proof," she added, "and proof needs patience. So before we talk outcomes, we build the record properly." Already knew that. Still, there's a particular weight to having someone with real credentials look at your evidence and simply say, "Yes, this is real." Picked up my bag. "Then let's build it properly," I said. Desmond came home that Thursday with takeout and a story already loaded up. I heard him before I saw him, laughing loud on the phone, retelling something from lunch. His own name coming up 3 times in his own story. I was sorting mail at the counter when he walked past me like I was part of the furniture. He hung up, set his keys down, and went straight to the fridge without a word to me, which had stopped surprising me about 8 months into our marriage. This was the Desmond I'd been quietly watching for weeks. Loose, confident, clearly convinced that Julian's comment at dinner had been filed away as a minor embarrassment and forgotten. Whatever he thought my silence meant, it wasn't what I was actually doing. That Saturday he left for an event without mentioning it beforehand, wearing a jacket I'd never seen, gone before I could ask a real question. I stood at the window and watched his car pull away. That night his cousin posted a photo online. A downtown restaurant, Desmond at the center of a table full of family and people who looked more like an audience than friends. He looked relaxed, comfortable mid-laugh. Priya wasn't in the photo, but she'd liked it within 4 minutes of it going up. I noted the time and kept moving. The mail that week was heavier than usual. 2 business envelopes mixed in with a regular stack, A habit Desmond had picked up of routing certain restaurant mail to the house instead of the office, something he'd never explained and I'd never pushed on. I set them aside for him, until the return address on the second envelope stopped me cold. It was from Ben Whitfield's company, the relationship I had built over 6 years before Desmond ever met the man. Opened it. Standard update letter. Updated contact info on file. Primary account holder listed as Desmond Okafor. Current referral source listed simply as internal. But in the older account history attached at the back, the archive summary they sometimes include, my name appeared once in small print under legacy notes, while the main active history now credited Desmond as the original contact. Someone over the years had smoothed the whole story down into a cleaner version that left me out almost entirely. I photographed every page. Then I folded the envelope, set it back with the rest of his mail, and finished sorting the pile like nothing had happened. Desmond walked back through the door well past 11 that night, still telling himself a story about who built what. I had just found another chapter of the real one. Vivian called on a Wednesday morning right on time, the way I'd learned to expect from her. "I need you to come in today if you can," she said. Her voice level but carrying something underneath it I recognized after months of reading her carefully. She'd found something that changed the weight of things. I was in her office by 11. She had documents laid out in a sequence that told the story before she even opened her mouth. Wire transfer records from my late mother's account. The original $38,000, plus 3 more transfers totaling almost $14,000 across that first year. None of it ever acknowledged or repaid. A supplier guarantee form carrying my professional consulting license number, signed 18 months into the business, back when a major hotel contract required a licensed guarantor and Desmond's credentials weren't enough on their own. Then the account records from Ben Whitfield's company, formally obtained after Vivian filed a preservation request. My name on the original agreement. The amendment filed later, exactly matching what that envelope at the house had shown. Desmond's lawyer had already submitted an early filing describing me as a supportive spouse, with no formal role in the business. Vivian laid his argument right next to her findings, like laying a weather forecast beside a photo of the actual storm. "His position falls apart at the guarantee document," she said. "A supportive spouse doesn't sign a supplier guarantee under her own professional license. That's a real legal act. It puts you inside the operating structure of that business no matter what the later paperwork tries to say." He nodded. "But that's not why I called you in today," she said, sliding the position paper aside and placing one single document in front of me, the original business license. My name was right there on the founding paperwork. Mary Calloway, co-owner. Then she laid a second document beside it, an amended filing from 3 years later. My name was gone. In the co-owner field, someone had typed the word none. And at the bottom, on the line meant for every original party to sign, was a signature. My name, written by someone who wasn't me. I stared at it for a long moment. "That's not my signature," I said. "I don't believe it is either," Vivian said carefully. "I had a document examiner take a preliminary look this morning, using verified samples from your older paperwork and bank forms. It's not final, but he found real inconsistencies. Pressure, letter shape, rhythm." The room went very still. "What happens now?" I asked. "We keep moving through civil discovery first," she said. "That stays the priority. We lock down the originals and the contribution trail properly." I pause. "If the final report backs up the early findings, this could be referred for regulatory review. Possibly criminal review too." She folded her hands. "That doesn't automatically mean your husband sat down and forged your name himself. Sometimes businesses use outside filing services, accountants, people who get careless. Right now we focus on what we can actually prove, not what feels satisfying." Something about how plainly she said that made me trust her even more. "You're telling me this is serious," I said. "I'm telling you that if your name was removed from a founding filing using a signature that isn't yours, the stakes here are bigger than a divorce." I looked down at my own name, written in someone else's hand, and understood that what began as simply setting the record straight had just become something Desmond was completely unprepared for. He found out on a Friday. I knew the second it reached him because his car was already in the driveway 2 hours before his usual time. He was sitting at the kitchen table, phone face up, wearing the stillness of a man who just got news that rearranged something and hadn't decided yet how to react to it. He looked up when I walked in. I set my bag down and went straight to the counter without acknowledging the weight he was carrying. I heard him exhale behind me, then pick up his phone. He made 3 calls over the next hour from the guest room with the door shut, not realizing how thin those walls actually were. I couldn't make out the first 2 voices. The third one I knew right away. Uncle Roscoe's particular way of answering the phone came through clear enough that I could follow the shape of it even without every word. Desmond's tone on that call was careful, controlled. The voice of a man asking for something he can't afford to name directly. It lasted about 10 minutes. When it ended, he came back out and poured himself a drink without offering me one, which had stopped being an oversight around month 9 of our marriage. He called me at just past 9 that same night. I looked at his name on the screen for a few seconds before answering. "You need to stop this," he said, calm and measured. His professional voice, the one built to sound reasonable while taking up all the space in the room. He said the restaurant was his vision, his years of work, and that whatever role I thought I played had already been paid back in full through the life the business gave me. The house, the comfort. He said comfort with real weight, like reminding me I used to need it. He said his lawyer had reviewed everything and found my claim baseless. He said Charleston was smaller than I thought, and this would cost me. Then he said, "You were never really a businesswoman, Mary. You were a wife who wanted to feel like one." The line went quiet for a moment. "I've noted the call, Desmond," I said. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours." Nothing else. He waited for an argument, for tears, for something to push against. There was nothing to push against. I ended the call and set the phone down beside a folder holding, among other things, a disputed signature tied directly to his authority over that business. He'd called to make me feel small enough to stop. Instead, he just confirmed he understood exactly how much trouble he was in. I drove to my friend Odessa's place on a Sunday afternoon without calling first. She opened the door before I even reached the porch, like she'd been expecting me regardless. She looked at my face for 1 second and stepped aside without a single question. "That was Odessa. She never made you explain the shape you showed up in." Her kitchen smelled like something slow on the stove. I sat at her little round table, the one with 3 mismatched chairs she'd owned for as long as I'd known her. The table I'd sat at through 2 job changes and a marriage that looked fine on paper and nowhere else. She set a bowl in front of me without asking if I was hungry. I hadn't eaten a real meal in days. I ate while she waited, patient in a way that never felt like waiting. It felt like she'd simply set everything else down and was fully there. When I finished, she refilled the bowl and set it back down. "I didn't call you the night of the dinner," I said. "I know," she said. "It wasn't because I didn't need you. I know that too." I looked out her window at the light hitting her old magnolia tree, bright on the top branches, shadowed at the trunk, and tried to find where to begin. "I loved him," I said. "I want to say that out loud to someone who won't use it against me or file it away as weakness. I loved him, and I believed what we were building together was real and shared. I was wrong about the shared part, and that's the piece that costs the most." Odessa said nothing. She didn't reach for my hand or rush toward comfort. That's really just a way of moving the conversation along. She just let it land. "I keep thinking about the woman who made that first phone call to Ben," I said. "The one who drove to the bank without blinking. She wasn't naive. She was sure. And I don't know how to explain to her what happened to everything she was so sure about." "You don't have to explain it to her," Odessa said. "She already became you." The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Something in my chest let go that had been held tight for so long I'd stopped noticing it as tension. Not grief exactly. Not relief either. Something older than both. The specific tiredness of a woman who's been carrying a full weight with perfect composure and finally set it down somewhere she was allowed to. I didn't cry, but I came close enough that Odessa looked down at her own hands, giving me the privacy of almost. We sat there until the light shifted in the tree. Then I picked up my bag. "I'm all right," I said. "I know," she said. "You've been all right the whole time. You just needed somewhere to put it down for a minute." Julian called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me what he was about to do, not to ask permission, but because he wanted me to hear it directly from him first. That kind of thought can't be taught. "I'm clearing my things out of Dad's storage unit today," he said. "And I'm talking to Uncle Roscoe before I do it." I asked if he was sure. "I've been sure," he said. "I was just waiting for the right moment to stop being quiet." He went to Roscoe's house first. I learned the details later, told with the same steadiness he brings to everything. He sat across from his uncle and told him plainly that he'd witnessed things that were now legally relevant. Real things. Specific enough that they'd stuck with him because of when they happened and what they revealed. He remembered being in the office the day Desmond described starting the restaurant to a potential investor without mentioning me once. Not by accident, but as something Desmond had clearly practiced saying that way many times before. Afterward, Desmond had come out celebrating and bought expensive takeout they normally couldn't afford. Julian had texted a friend that same night, joking about the price of the food. The text was still sitting in an old phone backup, dated. He remembered riding in the truck when Desmond said about Ben Whitfield's company. "She made the call, but I'm the one who really built it into something." Desmond had repeated that line twice on the drive, like convincing himself. Julian had jotted part of it down in a notes app he used back then to track deliveries. And he remembered most clearly the evening Desmond came home from a filing appointment and said, with real satisfaction, that fixing my name off the original paperwork had just been a formality he'd been meaning to handle. Julian said nothing that evening. He was 17. But he filed it away carefully, the way he filed everything, without ever announcing he was doing it. He told Roscoe that if a lawyer ever asked him questions under oath, he'd answer every single one truthfully, no hesitation. Roscoe said very little the whole time. Julian described him as a man suddenly doing math he never expected to need. After leaving Roscoe's house, Julian went to the storage unit, pulled out the last of his boxes, and drove them straight to my place, stacking them quietly in the spare room before finding me in the kitchen. "It's done," he said. I made us both coffee, and we sat without needing to fill the silence. What I didn't learn until that evening was what Roscoe had done the second Julian left. He'd called Desmond. That call lasted about 6 minutes. I never heard the content of it directly, but I felt the result of it show up at my front door at 7:45 that night, the first time Desmond had come by since the legal process officially opened. I didn't let him in. I stood in the doorway and waited. His face had the specific look of a man who just understood something he could never unknow. All the performance was gone. What was left wasn't rage or threats. It was the look of a man realizing his own son had been quietly watching his whole life, and had chosen, carefully and permanently, to hold on to only the parts that actually mattered. He stood on that porch for maybe 10 seconds. Then he left. Uncle Roscoe called me on a Thursday morning. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but to make sure he understood the call was happening on my terms. "Mary," he said. His voice missing all the confidence it carried at that dinner table, replaced by the careful tone of a man who'd recently sat across from a lawyer and come away rearranged. He started with context that was supposed to sound like concern but was really about protecting himself. He hadn't understood what Desmond was really asking him to do. He'd accepted a property transfer in good faith. He wanted me to know he never meant to be part of anything that would hurt me. I let him finish. "I appreciate you calling," I said. "My lawyer is already aware of the transfer. Whatever you need to do to protect yourself, I'd move quickly." Silence. "That's all I have for you, Roscoe," I said and hung up. He showed up 2 days later without calling first. I watched his car from the window and decided what letting him in versus turning him away would each cost me. I opened the door before he knocked. He was a big man who'd always used his size to fill a room, but standing on my porch that afternoon, He looked smaller in a way that had nothing to do with his height. He had a property transfer he hadn't fully understood the risk of, and a nephew whose honesty was pulling the floor out from under everyone who'd laughed that night. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the same doorway Desmond had stood in 11 seconds before walking away, and looked at Roscoe with the patience of someone who'd already decided what this conversation was worth. He said he was sorry about the dinner. The way people apologize once staying silent has become more uncomfortable than speaking up. I took it in without expression. I didn't understand what he was asking me to hold on to, he said. I believe you, I said. That's between you and your lawyer now. He looked at me a long moment. I think he'd come expecting something that would make him feel better about laughing that night. What he found instead was a woman who'd already closed the books on that evening and had nothing left to give him from it. He left without what he'd come for. 2 more calls came that week, easier to manage from a distance. A cousin who'd laughed and was now hearing the legal situation was worse than Desmond had let on, and a woman from the dinner calling with the specific energy of someone gathering gossip disguised as concern. I was polite with both and gave away nothing. By the end of that week, the family who'd filled that banquet hall with laughter had gone very quiet, and their silence felt nothing at all like mine. Vivian called on a Monday with the kind of calm that carries good news without announcing it right away. The property transfer to Roscoe had been flagged during discovery as a bad faith transfer, moved right after the legal process opened, timing that made the intent almost impossible to argue around. The court had noted it. Desmond's lawyer's response, Vivian said, was thin. The valuation adjustment, once the concealment came to light, moved entirely in my favor. His own lawyer is starting to distance himself from these decisions, she said. When your representation starts pulling back, your position has already collapsed. I thanked her and set the phone down. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing in me reaching for celebration. What I felt instead was the quiet settledness of watching something land exactly where the evidence always said it would. What reached me next came through Julian. Desmond had told Priya about the legal dispute directly, not out of honesty, but because the money picture had become impossible to hide from someone who'd been quietly making plans around it. He told her the value of everything was under dispute. He told her any payout would come slowly, over years, out of future profits. Priya stopped answering his calls the very next day. I took that in and filed it away without comment. She'd made her calculations the same way Desmond had made his, and when the picture changed shape, she reacted accordingly. None of it needed my energy. Desmond called me on a Wednesday night, just past 10. I answered because Vivian had told me to document every contact, and because something in the way he called, the hour, the fact that it came from his own phone instead of through a lawyer, told me this call would be different. His voice had none of its usual architecture. No control, no built argument. What came through was a man who'd run out of positions to defend, and was standing in the open with nothing left to hide behind. I knew from the start I couldn't have built it without you, he said. I said nothing. I knew it when you made that call to Ben. I knew it every time someone in this industry took a meeting because your name was attached. He paused. I just never thought you'd make me actually say it out loud. The line sat quiet a long moment. I needed to hear you say it, I said. And now you have. I ended the call. I sat holding the phone for a while after, not pulled toward forgiveness, not pulled back toward grief either, just carrying the particular weight of finally hearing a private truth spoken aloud by the one person who'd spent years pretending otherwise. It changed nothing about what came next. But it closed something that had been left open a long time. The settlement meeting ran 2 hours and 9 minutes. I know because I checked my watch sitting down and again when Vivian slid the final page across the table, not from impatience, but from the habit of a woman who spent her career understanding that time has a cost, and knowing that cost tells you something about what a thing was really worth. Desmond wasn't in the room. His lawyer sat across a deliberately neutral conference table, in a building that belonged to neither firm, chosen for exactly that reason. Negotiations had run longer than either side expected, with real fights over valuation and future projections, 2 earlier mediation sessions ending without agreement before this final meeting was even scheduled. The terms came out in order. My original contribution, over $51,000 across the initial transfer and the later ones, returned in full, plus fair growth calculated conservatively across the years it had sat inside the business unacknowledged. I looked at the number and thought briefly of a gray morning outside a bank, and said nothing. My founding share, established through the paper trail, the guarantee, Julian's account, and the disputed signature, translated into a formal valuation of my role in building the business from nothing. Desmond's lawyer fought the percentage hard and won some ground back. Vivian let some of it go strategically in exchange for stronger terms elsewhere. That's how real settlements work. Nobody walks out having won every single point. The house stayed mine, not from some dramatic courtroom ruling, but because the records clearly showed most of the mortgage and every renovation had been paid through income tied directly to my own consulting work. Desmond kept running the restaurant, but it had also been valued honestly by an outside accounting firm both sides finally agreed to after weeks of arguing over each other's numbers. What was left after taxes, debts, and realistic future income wasn't the empire he'd been describing at parties for years. It was a stable, modest business with real obligations, and some of those obligations now belonged to me, paid out quarterly across 4 years, since neither side believed the business could survive one lump payment without folding. Every door I'd ever opened for that business was sitting somewhere in those documents. Ben Whitfield's company, the guarantee, the founding money, all of it turned from memory into numbers and settled across a table on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The forgery question moved on its own separate track entirely, outside the settlement, outside my control. Vivian had referred it for formal review, but she'd made one thing very clear through the whole process. A civil settlement and a criminal finding are two completely different roads, and one doesn't guarantee the other. Vivian slid the final page across. "This is where you sign," she said. I read every single line before picking up the pen, not because I doubted her work, but because I'd learned, in a bank in a filing office, across 9 years of watching what happens when women stop reading what they sign, that the most expensive mistakes always hide in the paragraphs people skip. I signed my name. Mary Calloway. Clean. And hurried. Every letter exactly where it belonged. Vivian squared the pages against the table. "It's done," she said. I set the pen down. The kitchen was full of morning light when Julian came downstairs. He'd stayed over, not because anything required it, just because that was the kind of steady presence he'd settled into since the settlement closed. Quiet, unannounced, like light coming through a window you'd forgotten was even uncovered. He made coffee without asking if I wanted any, set a cup beside me the way people do once they know a space well enough to feel like they belong in it. I wrapped both hands around the cup and watched him move through my kitchen easily, not performing anything, just there. Odessa arrived at 11 with food she hadn't bothered calling ahead about. I heard her car and opened the door before she even knocked, the same way she'd opened hers for me that Sunday afternoon that felt both recent and very far away. She set things down on the counter and looked around the kitchen the way you look at a room that's been through something and come out the other side still standing. "Good light in here," she said. "Always has been," I said. We ate at the little round table. Julian pulled close to the window. The three of us, no occasion, no reason. Just the easy comfort of people who've earned their seats at the same table and have nothing left to prove to each other or anyone else. After Odessa left and Julian wandered off to the back of the house, I stood at the counter in the quiet afternoon light and let myself just be inside it. This was the same counter I'd stood at the night after the dinner, moving room to room, touching nothing, quietly counting everything my own hands had built and chosen and arranged long before Desmond Okafor ever walked through that front door. I looked at the drawer where the folder used to live. Now. Closed. Everything it once held had passed through the right hands and done its job, and wasn't needed anymore. Everything around me now was what had always been mine. The counter I picked for its morning light. The shelf I built alone on a Saturday. The painting I bought before I ever spoke his name. All of it mine before he arrived. All of it mine now that he was gone. Not won back. Not reclaimed. Just always mine, waiting patiently the whole time for a temporary arrangement to finally end. I pulled a notepad from the kitchen drawer, The one I kept for grocery lists and phone numbers and the ordinary business of a life that belonged entirely to me. I uncapped a pen and wrote at the top of a clean page. Not a signature. Not a legal paper. Not a correction to any public record. Just a name. Mary Calloway. I looked at it for a long moment, every letter sitting exactly where I'd put it, belonging to no filing, no amendment, no man who once called it a formality. Just mine. My name was always Calloway.